Assalamu alaikum everyone, this is Usman from Usman Code. In our last video, we discussed one-to-one relationship using Entity Framework Core 8.0. Today's topic is one-to-many relationship and let's see how we can implement using Entity Framework Core 8.0. We will jump back to our school DB context and currently we have one DB set here, the users, and let's go into the users entity, and we previously had user address entity inside that same file, which is kind of not a good practice. Today we will going to create another class that will be devices. Think about this scenario in a way that our user can have multiple phones or tablets, desktop or laptop PCs. So we can say a user can have multiple devices. So let's try to implement that relationship. Like one user can have multiple devices, and now there comes the interesting part, which is a device cannot exist without any user, which means that is one to many required relationship. A device must have one user. A device cannot exist without any user. So this is, we can say, a category of one to many relationship where we can say dependent entity can't exist without the independent entity, right? So let's try to implement that one, and for this I will be creating a separate file as well today, which will be our device. So I will name it device like this, and we can create a ID. Our device will have an ID and will have a name at least. And because that is a one-to-many relationship, let's go back to that user entity file, and we need to add here the collection for those devices. So this is first step. For that one, we will create public I collection of device, and I can name it devices, and we should normally initialize those collections with hash set, but for now let's initialize this with list. There is a reason why we should use hash set with many relationships implementation, but for now let's keep it simple with a list. Okay, so that is the first step. We have configured the many side of this relation, and let's go back to the device where we will be covering the first side, the one side of this relationship. So I will first be add the foreign key from user entity, that will be public int user entity ID, that will be foreign key, and for the navigation property we need to add public user entity and the catasetter. So because this is required relationship, I'm not putting question mark here. It should be required with every entity, and also that should be initialized. So to make it a non-nullable, we can use this expression null with the exclamation mark. Okay, so that is the second step. We have configured this side of the entity. So now our device will belong to a user, and from other way around, the user will have multiple devices, right? And this is required one-to-many relationship. We haven't explicitly used annotations, especially when we go to the device. We haven't configured or added the foreign key attribute here because from standard point of view, entity framework consider the property which has ID at the end with the same name as its entity name, right? So user entity ID, so it takes care of this property and consider it as foreign key. Let's say if we want to add some column with some other name, let's say ABC ID, in that case the foreign key attribute here will be required, right? So let's to just keep it simple, let's keep that thing in mind, and for now we will be using user entity and ID as foreign key. So no annotations, no Fluent API. What is Fluent API? To configure those relationships along with their additional properties setup, we need to use Fluent API that we use in SchoolDB context, basically in the context class. Particularly in the context class, we have a override method which is on model creating. This is a method. Here we need to configure any relationships, and that comes when we want to configure the relationship through Fluent API only, and we want to use some advanced properties or advanced configuration, let's say cascade delete. For now, let's keep it simple. That is not required, by the way. To run the existing implementation, we have configured one to many relationship, and the last thing will be in the context class. Let's include the DB set for devices as well. Even that is not required if we only want to access users and then devices of those users. But if we want to access directly the devices where user ID is something, then we need to configure DB set for the devices as well. So let's keep it simple as well, and let's not include that one. And let me just clear this one, and let's add a migration because we have did some changes in the context in terms of the entity in the context. So I will use add migration devices. I'm adding few devices in that table, in that database as a table, and those devices are in one-to-many relation with users. So now the devices migration is ready. We have that new table getting introduced in our database, and let's use update database to push or implement those changes to actual database, and we have the error. That is fine. All right, so for that one, let me clean my database. I'm just in the process of cleaning database, and now we can apply the update database command. Now in this time we have those tables created. We can see that. All right, let me run this first to see everything is fine, and for that one we already have our .http file. Let's hit those send endpoint, the send request for the get endpoint. So this is currently empty, that is fine. And let's try to add few users here, and get command here will return us the user and its devices. So devices are currently empty, which is good. And we have now introduced a separate endpoint to test that relation, that is against create user with devices, and that is get endpoint. We are not going to post any model. We just want to hard code the creation of that new device along with the user. So we have that endpoint, and we need to create that one in our user controller. Let's go in the down to that file, the class, and let's try to create that public I action result, and I can name it create user devices, and this is nothing, just will return us what should we need to return, let's say for now okay with working. And to introduce multiple get endpoints inside same class, we need to use the route value. So now that endpoint will work for us. So let's go back to HTTP file and now send the request. We have working returned, and now we can add a user with devices. For that one, I will be creating for new user entity, and we can name this user test user with a device. And what are the other properties inside that? Devices address, we don't need address. We can populate devices for that user. For that one, we can initialize a new list, and that list is of type device. And let's try to add couple of devices here. And against every device, let's see, I can name it device one like this, and another device with name device two. So two devices with a single user are going to be created, and that is now it. And what about the user service? So we have that user service here, and what we only need to do is to use its existing. So existing, okay, all right. So let's use the existing method from user service, and new user, we can pass that new user to this one. So let me run this service once, and let's try that endpoint now. So this is how we are creating a user with devices, and this is one-to-many relationship. Okay, and let's go back here, try to call get endpoint. That is fine. Now let's try to hit create user with devices, and it returns us working, which means a user has been created. Yes, a user has been created, but devices are not coming. The reason is inside that user service, where the user service is here, we need to explicitly include every relationship we want to fetch from database, which means we need to again call dot include, and in that include we need to put that devices key as well, because in the user entity its name is devices, right? All right, let me rerun the application once again and go to our .http file, and again try to hit get users. Right, so this time we are getting an error. Oh, that should be devices. Got it now. Let's hit Control F5, and now try HTTP endpoint. This time we are getting the devices detail as well. We can see that. So this is how we can implement one-to-many relationship, where that dependent entities, in those dependent entities the foreign key is required. What I mean by this one, let's say in that device table we want to add a device with plus, and we want to name it, and as soon as we try to save it, it will say cannot insert a null value into column user entity ID, which means a user must be there. So that is what it means by required. So let's say if a user has of ID 1, it should be linked with that user automatically, right? So the other point we discussed, like the Fluent API. So Fluent API is very useful and powerful, especially when we want to use some advanced configurations or setting against those relationship. One of its example is cascade delete. So before that, let me show you that if I go to device, or not device, if I go to the user and try to delete a user which has that linked device, so we are not able to delete that one. So in that address, let me clean that address to reduce any further complexities. Let's try to delete a user. We are able to delete. What about its devices? So its device is also deleted. And what if I try to delete other user and refresh? And let's go back to the devices. Refresh, devices are also deleted, which means by default cascade delete is enabled if we are not configuring it, and if we want to disable it, we need to explicitly mention through Fluent API. So that was all for this video. Now we can create one-to-many relationships where the dependent entities are required. In our next video, we will try to implement one-to-many optional relationship, which means in our scenario, devices can exist without any user, right? We will see how we can implement that in our next video. And in case of any question or queries, do ask me in the comment. And if you haven't subscribed to my channel, do subscribe to get the latest updates right away. Thanks everyone, and see you in the next one.